Well, thank you so much for coming out on the first week of class. I really appreciate that. I know it's a busy time, and I'm really happy to kind of share this work with you. I want to say just a little bit. I won't take up too much of your time, but yeah. So this body of work actually started with a flash flood, and it actually ended with a flash flood. But I'll tell you more about that later. So come on in. Come on in.
I don't think it waits.
Free food, free water. So in 2020, during the pandemic, I was teaching, and there was a downpour happening, and I heard screaming on the street, and I went down, and our whole street was flooded, and I had several feet of water in my basement, and that was a mess. It kind of derailed my week, obviously, but then I realized what had happened was my studio has a drain that feeds into the Anacostia River, and there was just so much water volume that it backed up, right? And at first I thought, let me use waterproof cameras and try to like follow this storm drain and see what the path is. How am I connected to this larger river? And it was one of the first times I actually, we walk around thinking that we're these separate entities, but suddenly I realized, wow, I'm totally tied into this river. Like everything I do in my studio that falls on the floor goes into the river. And that should have realized that earlier, but suddenly it was really impactful. Tom Waits says that every song needs an address. And so the address for this project is literally coming out of the storm drain in my house. And so what I decided to do was follow that storm drain out, and where it ended up in the river, I just spent some time watching, right? And what did I see? Primarily water bottles floating down the river because the Anacostia is very polluted. Trash along the shores, but also wildlife. And I thought, what can I do? I got so fascinated with these water bottles, and actually I'd done a project before using the water bottles. And so my first idea was to hook up a video camera and just see where does the water bottle go? And I had this whole idea of like, I'll follow it all the way up to the Chesapeake or something like that. But then when I hooked it up, actually this video that's playing right here was the first thing that the camera came back with. And I was just so shocked so what you're seeing upside down is basically like construction fencing. That orange stuff is just that plastic fencing. But the way that the light beams hit it and then illuminated the water, it just became this other realm. And I thought that was so fascinating. And I was kind of hypnotized by it, and I thought there's also a fish that showed up that I didn't see at all from above the water. And so I thought, this has some potential. Maybe I don't need to just be following this water bottle as far as it goes. Maybe there's more to be told about just this ecosystem that's right in front of me. And also part of this journey was just reading and learning, so I'm going to read a few things along the way. Elizabeth Gross in Time Travel says, invent machines not for what we can do with them, but for the ways in which they transform us beyond even our control. And I think this machine just completely opened up something for me. So I started to float it down the river further and further. What I found so interesting is that it's like a view into this underworld, right? You could see branches, you could see sediment, and just this other sort of realm. So I started reading this book that I highly recommend called The Underland by Robert McFarlane. Have you read it?
I have.
Yeah, it's fantastic, right? He spent 10 years going to the deepest parts of the earth that he could find, and just reporting back in this really lyrical, poetic way. And that just really kind of blew my mind. So just this idea of what goes on beneath our feet, what are we not really paying attention to, I found super, super interesting. I have to credit Christopher Lonergan for suggesting that I read Julia Kristeva, and that was a breakthrough because she talks about these two sort of states of consciousness, right? We have the control, which is the symbolic, and then we have the semiotic, which is a pre-verbal state of mind. This she calls prosody, or poetry's departure from prose, the air or the song beneath the text. So, and you gave me a reading of the videos, which was like almost like this. The above water was like a controlling force, and the below water was this more dreamlike, sort of unhinged, hallucinogenic almost, psychedelic realm. And then she talks about this, something called the thetic, which is the transition between those two states. And so that was really quite interesting, and was just a whole nother read that I hadn't thought of. So within that Robert McFarlane book, he quotes Amitav Ghosh in The Great Derangement, and he basically comes up with 3 challenges. One is how to represent the unfoldings of actions and consequences within deep time. That's a huge challenge. But that's what kind of led me to this piece here. So as I started to learn more about this river that I've lived near almost all my life, I read that the Native Americans obviously have been here for a lot longer than we have. And they estimate 10,000 years, but it's likelihood much, much longer than that, right? So here we have just the red is the only time that the Europeans have been here. And so we have this deep, deep, deep time that's going on. But we've managed to screw things up quite poorly since we've shown up. The line that you're seeing is the actual scale of, the exact scale of the water. So the height of the water from here to Capitol Hill. Now, when the Native Americans were here, it was upwards of 40 feet deep. So as soon as the Europeans came, they planted a lot of tobacco and ripped up the shores. In the map on the back, you'll see where they have plans to get rid of vast swaths of wetlands in the 1930s, I believe. That big long map is basically their plans to just reroute the river so ships can go through. So all that sediment meant that the river became a lot more opaque, and that the same species couldn't thrive. So this wall is sort of like the invasive wall. These are Asiatic clams that are invasive species in the river that I collected. I basically started to challenge myself. Whatever I saw in the video, I would make a piece about. So these are collected from the river, and I would collect sediment and water from the river and use that in the piece as well. And then this video is kind of a combination of a transition from invasives to all the waterfowl, because I was there in the winter, and the waterfowl were all looking at me sideways all the time, and they're all checking me out. And I really wanted, like Megan was asking me, did you get any with them right up in front of your camera? And you never do, because they can see you too well. They would never let you get that close. So studying these waterfowl, I came up with this piece, which is about the way that they see. They see in this really panoramic way, so they can see prey. And then they can also zoom in very, very well. So that's why this is basically a safety mirror that you see on the corner, you know, where you can see if somebody's coming. And so I indented it and then put a steel ball on it and coated it in resin. They also have really poor depth of field, so I tried to make the center of it a little bit blurry. So Ghosh also says, recognize the aliveness of the more than human world. And that's kind of what I was trying to do here, is just really dig into the things that I was seeing, and like, what do these creatures possess that humans don't? How do their capacities go beyond us? And then here, this was just a really random thing. I was done for the day. I hadn't really found anything I was thinking was going to work, and there was a little kind of almost like puddle to the side, and I put the camera in, and there's all these little tiny schools of mummy chug fish that showed up. And the juxtaposition of like the industrial train going by with the school of fish was really kind of interesting and inspiring. And so I started doing these pieces about fish and groupings of fish. These are 3D prints of fish. So you can see it's kind of a repetition of the same fish over and over again. This one is one where I tried there's a fish called the shad that they're trying to bring back to DC. It's like one of the native fish. So I try to kind of replicate what that looked like. But typically, when you see these fish, there's lots of plastic and debris floating all around them. You know, here you see the clams with like mud and sediment. So a lot of it. So the other thing that Ghosh says is how to come to terms with the profound decentering of human presence. And this piece here is one that I created earlier. Wasn't super happy with. I was trying to basically learning about schools of fish, learning that they all stay equidistant apart, and they just sort of sense their neighbors. So it didn't have any of the electronics on it. A lot more like this. And then right before the show, I just had thought it would be really interesting to kind of activate them, to hook them up with LEDs. And this is a work in progress. It has photo transistors. Originally, I wanted to have every fish be able to sense every other fish, and then you could shine your cell phone light, and it would activate it to just light up and fade away. But what I realized is that when you hook up a lot of photo transistors, the electricity varies quite a bit across the circuit, and so it's going to take a lot more engineering to get that right. But this is kind of like what I imagined. So right now what you have is these little microcontrollers are triggering, because the lights are pretty bright, a sequence of flashing. So yeah, so then moving on. A lot you'll see in the show is sort of this, how the natural world and the digital world overlap. Like, School of Fish is a lot like a decentralized network, right? Or a cloud. And so we tend to think of ourselves as very separate, but in fact, right, we share a lot of the same qualities. That gets sort of extended in these pieces where I constantly saw branches and roots underwater. So in another book, Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, evolutionary biologist Len Margulis said that all living beings, not just animals, but plants and microorganisms, perceive. To survive an organic body must perceive, it must seek, and at least recognize food and avoid environmental danger. And I just love seeing these. Right now the roots aren't quite featured on the video, but there's something super mesmerizing about just seeing these little tendrils from the subaquatic. There's the camera, so you can see it. It's basically a lampshade with 3 water bottles that you tied to. It's a very rough design, but it survived all this time. And then there's one camera that's exactly equal underneath. These pieces here are just things that I was collecting while I was there. Some of the this is one of the earliest pieces with resin. And here I'm just basically using stills from the video. So this is an early version, and this is a much later version of kind of the same content. And what I started to think about also is that, so the underground realm, the other thing about it is that's where all of our digital stuff comes from, right? We mine these precious metals and destroy the earth in order to get our cell phone batteries and our electric vehicles, right? So we're really entwined with this underground world, and I thought about the branches that we use are also the same thing as all these tangled cables that we have. So these are all stripped USB and other cables intertwined with branches that I was collecting from the sites. So then moving on here, the AI pieces. So in that same sort of realm, I was interested in how these more than human creatures can perceive more than we can. We're one of the few species that can't see ultraviolet, in our vision. So there's a larger world out there than our perception, than we're able to perceive. And that's the same sort of thing that's sort of true with AI, right? It has processing power that is greater than ours. So I was interested in experimenting with that. So what I did was take 50 stills from these videos and feed them to an AI. And that's what's called a generative adversarial network. And in the rooms, you can see on the small screen is this AI network actually trying to figure out how to produce the images. The way it works is there's 2 networks. You give it a data set, and then one network tries to reproduce it, and the other one judges it. It says, you're doing a good job or you're not. And so it keeps, what you'll see is it first starts with a really hyper neon color, it's way off, and then it'll say no, no, and it'll slowly get a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. And then I end it, several hours in, and what you have is this kind of distorted, or maybe not even distorted, but just a different way of looking at this above water, below water space. And then I took materials and paint and tried to replicate what the AI is doing. So in a way, it's a collaboration between me and the AI. And I got the idea at a conference I went to. There's a jazz pianist who said he was always getting in ruts and playing the same sounds. So he started playing with an AI because it would always surprise him, and it would make him like, oh, I'd never think to do that, you know. So in the same way, this really like forced me into some different territories. So these are all coated in resin, and these three are actually on mirrors, and that was to mimic this like liminal space between, you know, the surface of the water is obviously reflected. So another person that was really influential was Julio Fine, and he wrote A Geology of Media. The underground lies at the crux of the technical imaginary of modernity, as both a place of hell, mining, extraction, and a place of technological futures. So, like, I mean, our whole like technological future relies on that underground space. And so this is the first time I've tried these projections. So I would love to hear your feedback on it at some point. This one is all Anacostia River, and then I got the opportunity to go to Portugal. So everything on these walls is Anacostia River. Everything on these walls is based on this trip to Portugal, which was a little bit strange because the rivers in Portugal where I was are some of the cleanest in the world, apparently. Which is a real counterpoint to what Anacostia River was actually called the Forgotten River because it was so polluted for so long. And so here you have this like almost impressionistic looking landscape, right? And really crystal clear waters. And this set is all, these two are from that place. I'm not gonna try to pronounce the Portuguese name, and then this one is from a place that has a hot springs. And they actually used it for a long time, and they said it had healing properties. But you can see sort of the difference. It's a little cloudier, a little darker. And then obviously in this video, there's a ton of water striders that I've always been kind of fascinated by. And so I fabricated these two pieces. Again, trying to learn about them, and it's such a fascinating creature. Like, they basically have hairs on their legs, and they hold air bubbles, and that's how they float. They're basically floating on air. And so I wanted to create this kind of bubble around it. It creates a hydrophilic environment. And then its front two legs, it just waits around for bugs that can't swim to fall in the water. And its two front legs will just like grab whatever falls in the water and eat it. So this is kind of built off of that, the front two legs jumping out. But then this piece didn't look like this at all. Maybe a month ago, we had another flood, and this whole piece was submerged in water. So what you'll see is it's rusting, right? And I thought, what am I going to do? I have to throw this out. But instead, I just thought, I'll just pour more dirty water on it. So I poured more of the Anacostia water on it, and it's probably going to rust. The entire thing is going to rust out. So it's in a state of change, just like everything in the river. And then this one is kind of playing off of the idea of a cluster or a swarm of water striders. And then the last thing is that I just learned that they communicate by pulsing the water. And so they actually have this kind of Morse code that they send to each other. And this is an older piece that predates all of this work that was more about sound waves. But it was the start of me working with mirrors, and this is ink on mirror. And so I just brought it back into juxtaposition with these newer works because I thought that's so cool. So I'll just end with Julio Fine also in a different book, a really cool book called Insect Media. He says Alfred Norton Whitehead proposed the idea that a key lesson insects can teach us is that we do not need hierarchical unifying control to operate. We are distributed systems with millions of centers of life in each animal body. And so the title of the show is Sentient River. I'm hoping that by bringing all these different flows of time, all of these different investigations into different types of more than human creatures, that we'll get a sense of this ecosystem as more than just a resource, right? More than something to take advantage of or to recreate on. Last quote, David Abrams in Spell of the Sensuous says, As long as we experience the invisible depths that surround us as empty space, we will be able to deny our thorough interdependence with other animals, plants, and living land that sustains us. Our disconnection with air allows us to dump toxins into that empty space, right? So it's really convenient for us to divide ourselves off from the animals and the landscape, because it helps us to not feel bad about killing creatures and toxifying all these ecosystems. So my hope here is that, at least for me, this has been kind of opening my eyes to all of the crazy things that are going on in the river that I had no idea, and that sort of changes the way that I look at when I walk by a storm drain and see that the recycling is spilled out in front of it, right? Like, you just know that stuff's going in there. So thank you all for coming out. That's all I have to say. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.